Good morning, everybody. Yeah. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for asking me to share my thinking or some elements of my thinking this morning. If you have seen the abstract, you will see that there is a question mark after fascism. And so it is American fascism question mark. I put the question mark there because I think it is important in political and social life to be clear about what one is struggling against. The naming of a conjuncture, of a regime, or forms of governmentality creates conditions and possibilities of different kind of activities. To name a regime, a conjuncture, or forms of governmentality is not, I would want to suggest to you, in this august academic body, is not an exercise, an academic exercise, because it has serious and profound consequences. So in these remarks, I'm not going to enunciate and name anything with any kind of categorical certainty. Rather, what I want to do is to talk about with you a series and point to you a series of what Stuart Hall would call a set of fragmentary contradictions as a certain kind of series. And here, I'm not then trying to think about a single moment or a single contradictory moment in what Stuart himself would call the life of a social formation, end of quote. But rather, thinking through the fragments of this moment, and more importantly, perhaps the practices of this moment, we want to think about how these fragments are reassembled from history and then create a certain kind of hegemony, or what I like to call rule over. As I do this, I also keep in my mind Foucault's injunction that power works not just to create the subject, but rather power also operates to create practices of objectification of the subject, therefore creating desires and other imaginaries. In my recent work, I've been arguing that under contemporary capitalism, in which commodification operates both as a sign as well as a drive of capital, that this objectification process works through a deep set of imaginaries and the imagination, creating what I've called, following the work of Jacqueline Rose and Donald Pease, a set of fantasies. And by fantasies, I mean a kind of production of imaginaries, which in my view are deeper than the conventionally understood ways of thinking about ideology. My final note in this brief preamble is this. In 2012, in a series of exchanges between myself and Stuart Hall about the moment, we both felt that the 2008 recession had begun the unraveling of neoliberalism. And we had this exchange between us about what the coming conjuncture would look like, and also, obviously, a discussion, given both our political positions, about what a left might look like. In one of these exchanges, where I was pointing to the possibilities of a certain kind of acceleration of right-wing governments moving into the mainstream, and therefore suggesting to him that his naming of Thatcherism as authoritarian populism would no longer be a viable political marker, I received perhaps the longest email from him about this. And this is what he said to me, and I'm summarizing it. He says, Tony, you should not be studying He's much older than I was, obviously, and so, you can say that in that way. Tony, you should not be studying. Tony, you should not be studying the contemporary moment through a kind of historical analogy, he says. He says he made it clear that to try and understand the conjuncture only through a historical analogy, he says, is to make what he would argue is a categorical mistake. He says that you needed to think about the actual conjuncture or the coming conjuncture as it is rooted in a complex configuration and forms of the present. He then says, you can do this, I do not have much time. He died 2 years after, in 2014. I will not bore you with the rest, with the full exchange, only to say this, that although James Baldwin says that history lives in our bodies, that the history of the present is never about repetition, but rather is about adaptation and reformulation. History moves like, in my view, more like a sedimented deposit. But in the process of its sedimentation, just as the process of sedimentation transforms rocks, the history of moving like a sedimentary deposit creates a form of metamorphism. That is, it also creates something that is new. So the work of history, therefore, is about adaptations, about reformulation, about creating new conjunctures. And so, if that is so, then what is the conjuncture that we are in? As I said, I'm not going to try and name it categorically. One of my arguments is going to be that fascism has become a kind of easy word for us to use to name something that is new, but that which we can't yet name in many ways. I am saying that because I would argue that the great moving right-wing show, which Stuart talked about, in which he identified Thatcherism, is still moving. Its contours are clear, I think. Its trajectory is becoming clear, I think. Yet, I do not think that it has consolidated itself. Most individuals talking about the neoliberalism mark neoliberalism with the coming together of three individuals in the political domain: Thatcher, Reagan, and Helmut Kohl from Germany. And for those of us who come from the global south, it is about the emergence of a Washington consensus. But I want to make it clear that there's something else that happened at that particular moment. One of them was the 1976 defeat of Salvador Allende and his overthrow, and the emergence of the Pinochet regime. It was in the Chile Pinochet regime that neoliberalism began to work itself out with all the people who belonged to the Milton School and the Chicago School who went to Chile. But in Pinochet regime was a totalitarian regime. And here I'm following Anna Arendt because of its regularized use of terror. I'm not talking about simply coercion, but of armed terror as a public means of control, as a part of a political process in which death functions as the regular sign of authority. The second event that I want to talk about that marks that neoliberal moment really is the military and political defeat of the Michael Manley regime in Jamaica in 1980. Professor Meeks and myself were around at that time. We were very young people, but we were living in Jamaica at that time. In that particular moment, 800 persons died in 10 months out of a population of 2.5 million persons, and then was replaced by a certain kind of regime in which the Siaga regime, in which inaugurated the neoliberal project in Jamaica, which still operates. And the third happened in this country. The third event, which I think also marks neoliberalism, was the drug war in the black communities and the ways in which we began to see the emergence of a so-called carceral state. My point about the emergence of neoliberalism is this, that neoliberalism was born in both military and political violence. And that I wanted, we like to think it was just born, right? That it just emerged. But I want to make an argument that it actually emerged in the midst of both military and political violence. And make this point because the consolidation of one regime and the emergence of a new conjuncture is never a peaceful historical process. Never. It is always marked by various forms of violences. So between 1980 and say 1976, I would say, people say 1980, I say 1976, then what you have had is 20 to the present, to 2008 rather, is that you've had many years of over 20 odd years of neoliberalism. And I don't want to go into what exactly all of that, what it meant, but we all know it, inequalities, etc. And the emergence of, in this country, of what some people have called the second Gilded Age. Within American society, though, the cracks within neoliberalism began to appear not just with the 2008 recession, but also began to appear in the emergence of birtherism. And I would think that this is really important for us to understand this moment, to begin to understand birtherism. Again, I'm not trying to do history conjuncture by trying to think of by working through historical analogy, but I'm trying to think about history as a way to allow us to begin to grapple with some of the present, because my argument is that history really works as sedimentary deposit, rearticulates, reformulates, and adapts things that actually create something, that create the new as we begin to see it. In other words, let's try and make it clear. In other words, unless there is a fundamental social and political revolution that create the breaks, and not just create political structural breaks, but also create epistemic breaks, then actually history not just repeats itself, but actually rearranges and readapts itself into something that we look at we see at a particular moment. When Donald Trump announced, and he wasn't yet running for president, when he announced that there is something wrong with Obama's passport, he says he doesn't want to show that passport. There is something wrong with that. He was tapping into a certain kind of imaginary in this country that had to do with immigration, nationality, and whiteness. All of these things were unspoken. But one of the points I want to make is that there is a certain kind of foundational platform, certain kind of ways in which society operates, in which imaginaries and fantasies are created that become embedded in society, that becomes a kind of common sense which we don't talk about, which we don't even have to talk about, but which you just have to, someone would say, you press a button and it then evokes a whole set of things in people's head. So when the birtherism movement, and Trump wasn't part of the birtherism movement, but by making that demand, where is his passport, became the head of the birtherism. And this, I think, is really important. So, he wasn't elected, right? It was that the actual rhetoric of where is the passport places him in a certain position that then allows, gives the birtherism a certain stamp. And one of the things that you would want to think about is how, in fact, he asked for that passport, and then a couple of days after, he was talking, a couple of weeks after, he was then thinking about running for presidency, and announced it in the Trump Tower on that elevator. There are whole sorts of symbolic things that are what people would call symbolic things that are happening. But what I would want to ask, there are things that is essentially around the imagination and around the desire. But it is around imagination and desire that comes, I would argue, out of a certain kind of whiteness that exists in the society. The critical here I would want to the birtherism argument, I would want to also suggest, draws from a certain immigration and nationality discourse. And that this nationality discourse has been going on, quite frankly, since the 1790s in this country, when there was a real discussion about white persons, or in the 19 as white persons as only citizens, or in the 1870s when there was talk in the Nationality Act about the stopping of what was then called obnoxious persons, or the court decisions, Supreme Court decisions in the 1880s, which ruled, and here I quote one judgment, that Americans showed a common understanding of race, and that there are certain things about this common understanding can reside in the process of naturalization, and that it was the following: living in the United States for 5 years, having good moral character, and that you are a free white person. This is not me, this is the Supreme Court. And so that therefore what you are looking at is that these things remain as sediments, remain in the society, and there's no break from them. They are readapted and reworked. And that therefore when the birther movements begins to think about passports and so on, and if you're born here, it is really around this. It is really evoking these kind of issues. So within the context of all of this, though, in the 19th century, one has to think about America as an empire. One has to think about America and manifest destiny and the move westward. Of course, we know that after post emancipation. That what you have, that there was the 14th Amendment that made the point that people, and I quoted, people of African descent and African natives, meaning people who were black, obviously, and enslaved, could now be citizens. Then, of course, by the time you get to 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what the point I'm making, therefore, is from inception of the white republic, because that's the inception of what you're looking at. 1776 wasn't just the emergence of the American Republic, it's the emergence of the white republic. From 1790, what you have in this country is a discussion about nationality and about citizenship. Not about questions of so-called national identity. Who is able to become an American citizen and who is not able to become an American citizen? So my point is to try and come to the present is that therefore birtherism draws from this. And because there's no rupture in the American society, birtherism becomes a kind of nostalgia. Becomes a kind of nostalgia that has to do with white supremacy. It's a kind of nostalgic imaginary. And it's in that nostalgic imaginary that you can then you need to frame the building of the wall, and you have to begin to talk about the business of mass deportations. So that I want to talk about, so I want to then just put on the table that therefore my first fantasy is the fantasy of birtherism. My second fantasy that I want to talk about is American exceptionalism. And that is, many of you would know in this room, draws from de Tocqueville's work on America and his 1831 sentence about America being exceptional. And what is important, I think, and interesting about this fantasy is how this fantasy plays out in America itself, and particularly, say, in the New England area, where we are supposed to be a city on the hill. And that when you think about the exceptionalism of America, you're not just thinking about uniqueness, because every country will say it is unique. I come from Jamaica originally. We like to think we are unique, right? So everybody, the British, everybody, Grenadians, everybody wants to think that they're unique. But what is the uniqueness? The uniqueness is God-given. The uniqueness is a matter of destiny. All right? The uniqueness now is not just about a certain way in which people think and so on, or that you're a country. Uniqueness has to do with God. The uniqueness has to do with a certain kind of destiny that needs to be fulfilled, a certain telos, if you wish, that needs to, that for which you have been given. And therefore, that uniqueness is around questions of not freedom, but is around a question of liberty. And we can talk about that if you want, because I want to make a profound distinction which is not made in political philosophy and political theory around this question of freedom and liberty. And to say that, quite frankly, for those of us who have been enslaved and who have a certain kind of history, that freedom is what is important, not liberty. And that if you look at the discourses around liberty and freedom and the speech acts around it, you could actually see that. But everybody, all the presidents, including Mr. Obama himself, would talk about the city on the hill, and therefore how America is exceptional. In Trump's inaugural speech in January, he talks about America becoming more exceptional than before. And if I could just say one thing very quickly. I have a book that's come out with the Smithsonian, and I don't know what the planners were thinking, but they organized the book launch on the inauguration weekend. I'm not sure what was going on in people's mind. So I had to go there. I had to be in DC for that weekend. And I kept on saying to persons, and I spoke to my wife, Professor Augusto, that I feel as if I'm in enemy territory in the hotel I stayed in, right? But more than that, when I got to the train station to come back, I wanted to get out of DC quickly after the book launch. I was in the train station and I watched the inaugural speech in the train station with a group of persons who were all white. I was the only black person in that train station. And I decided to watch the inaugural speech. And there was a gentleman beside me. And when President Trump began to talk about exceptionalism, the gentleman beside me began to breathe so heavily that I had to say to myself, my God, if he has a heart attack in here, what am I supposed to do? Right? As the only black person sitting in the train station. Literally, that was going through my head. But what was important, I thought, at the time, was how the note of exceptionalism and greatness, what it evoked in him. I mean, the rest of the speeches he was listening to, but that business of exceptionalism and greatness evoked in him a certain kind of affect in which he was just breathing as if he was going to pass out. So there is a way in which, therefore, the America being great again is my second fantasy, and becomes important in the context of the decline of American power. Decline of American power, the emergence of the 20th century, is also seen as the emergence of American imperial power. And what I would want to argue is that though that fantasy of American is great, the American exceptionalism and birtherism, therefore, and works together. And that these fantasies are really nostalgic workings in which the imaginaries congeal into what Trump himself has called common sense. And when thinking about common sense, I would want to suggest to this group that one needs to think of Gramsci's common sense, Gramsci's own reflections on common sense, and as a kind of understanding of contradictory everyday experiences. What Trumpism therefore seeks to do is to create a common sense fantasy of a certain kind of rebuilding of nostalgic imaginaries to create a new hegemony and of control and rule. There are other things, but time doesn't allow me, and I think we all know them, when you can have the economist saying the would-be king, then, things about I would want to, about imperial power, about imperial presidency, and the way in which that now has become a certain kind of bellicose understanding, a bellicose performance. But there's one thing I want to say, which I think is important because it is very much something about American power, which we tend to forget. In the 1960s, right after McCarthyism, an intellectual historian at Columbia, Richard Hoffensteiner, wrote a very serious, important set of texts. One of them was about paranoia and conspiracy in the United States. And that there's a way in which paranoia works in the United States alongside conspiracy to create a certain kind of politics. And he argued that McCarthyism was one of part of that. What I would want to argue is that both paranoia and conspiracy now congeal today. History is a deposit that travels, congeal today into what is called fake news or alternative facts. So that therefore the other fantasy is to think about fake news, paranoia, and conspiracy, and how that works to create alternative facts. The political alliance that brought Trump into office is really, as we know, a mass base of white workers, of white women, of some black folks, of some Hispanics. And I think that what is important, though, what is new in this situation is the emergence of a certain kind of elite. So I hear people say Trump is populism, but it is a certain kind of populism, if you want to use that phrase. It is a populism from above. It is a certain kind of elite populism. And what is interesting and what is new, I think, to think about is to think about the ways in which what some would call a technological oligarchy are now positioning themselves to work with the regime. This, I think, is something that is new that one has to look at, because this particular oligarchy and what it believes is really important. This oligarchy believes in something called transhumanism. Transhumanism is really about the relationship of technology to human beings. The argument, and I'm really, I'm not doing justice to it, but the argument in a nutshell is that human beings, technology can in fact become part of the human experience. And if it becomes part of the human experience, then the question is, how do you create new babies, et cetera, et cetera? How do you create people with certain kind of intelligences, et cetera, et cetera? When you read it properly, it's a merger of the human and technology. And when you read it clearly, what you have to do is to go back to eugenics, to 19th century eugenics, and the ways in which particularly German scientists were experimenting, and American scientists were experimenting with eugenics. What is interesting is that they call themselves technologists. If you ask Moss what he is, he will tell you I'm a technologist. So the question of technology, the question of AI and so on, becomes important as a way in which the authoritarian right, in my view, is going to think about the future. That's going to run up against the certain kind of conspiratorial theories that exist in Trump's regime. And it's going to run up against the Kennedy, for example, who has a different view about just quite frankly about science and simple things like vaccines. What is important, I think, is what the technologists say. And the technologists say that the saving of America is critical because, in their words, America is the last bastion of Western civilization. Right? And if that is so, then the question becomes very much, how do you save this Western civilization? Which allows Trump to say things like, if I am saving the society and I do things that are not legal, I cannot be charged because, basically it's about saving the society. That is an argument that I'm almost sure that comes from inside discussions about what is about America being the last bastion of Western civilization, and therefore what can be justified in the saving of America, and therefore of Western civilization. So can we name this? Can we name this late fascism, as some writers have called it, or are we in a different conjuncture of a specific kind of American phenomenon in a world where the right wing is not now a moving show, as Stuart would put it, but rapidly becoming the fundamental common ground? My argument very simply is that neoliberalism is passing. And that in that moment of neoliberalism passing, that we are in a conjuncture that is not, the outlines are clear, but the actual innards of that conjuncture, and for us to name it as something, in my view, are still not clear. The argument about fascism, very quickly, is an argument that has always been in the United States, and I would want to suggest to you all, comes out of, there's a black anti-fascist tradition which we tend to ignore. And that tradition, in the 1970s comes out, 1960s comes out of the work of the Black Panther Party, particularly comes out of the brilliant writings of, in my view, and I don't use that word often, and the student in here will know I don't never use that word, but the brilliant writings of people like George Jackson. But even goes further back to people who were the writers of people like Aimé Césaire, and the writing of people like George Padmore in the 1930s, who developed a notion of something called colonial fascism. What we need to think about, I think, is the way in which slavery, not just as racial discrimination and racial power and so on, but slavery, racial slavery, as what Du Bois calls a system of arbitrary will, of people living under arbitrary will. Secondly, the ways in which the Reconstruction defeated any kind of quote-unquote progressive movement, after emancipation. The establishment of Jim Crowism, which actually is a form of authoritarianism. And also secular colonialism, and the way in which the destruction of the indigenous population. And to therefore put together all those things and say, okay, what we have in this moment is a coming together of these things in the way in which we might want to think about America. That all these currents and all these fragments have congealed into a force which will govern America, and in my view, will attempt to crush American liberalism. Because we are in what Gramsci would call an interregnum, then in that moment, I would argue, monsters are created. And one of the things that we are seeing is the creation of these certain monsters. How long will this last? Will it consolidate itself, and will it win? If it wins, then in the 21st century, we will be into a new conjuncture, in which the human species will be in great danger. I don't say just white folks or black folks, I said the human species, in my view, will be in great danger. What does resistance look like? What does social change look like? What is the role of the imagination? And it, to me, is absolutely critical. What is the role of the imagination in such struggles to remove this regime? These are questions which face us. And in my view, they will face us for some time. But I want to end with two pieces of hope. Yesterday, I'm at the Providence train station in the morning, taking a group of students on a field trip to the MFA Museum in Boston, where we are working with them on a particular project. And in the train station, there's a cafe. And the sign in the cafe, instead of giving us the menu, says, "This cafe does not support fascism today, tomorrow, or ever." And I took a picture and sent it to a group of a whole sort of people, including Professor Meeks. Because to me, to see that it was just remarkable, because it shows a certain kind of defiance, which is ordinary. Just a cafe. And instead of the menu, this is what you put down. The second thing was a vote yesterday at Apple. The shareholders at Apple voted against the DEI injunction from Trump. And Apple, I'm from the left. I've made that very clear. So I'm not a fan of a sort of, one uses Apple, yes, but I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of a certain kind of corporations and so on. Apple has a set of practices which I don't particularly agree with, in worker practices in particular, in various places. But what struck me was that DEI is low-hanging fruit, because this is a racist society. But to have a situation in which the shareholders vote overwhelmingly, not by one vote, but overwhelmingly, to actually continue with what they understand to be their DEI program, showed me that that this authoritarianism, whatever, fascism, this is why I say fascism in a question mark, that has not yet consolidated itself. When will it consolidate itself? I have no idea. But I would want to suggest to you that we are at a moment, the interregnum, where it is trying to consolidate itself, so the business of the resistance to it becomes absolutely critical. Thanks very much for listening to me this morning.